Thank you very much for this most gracious introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's almost intimidating to speak about arts of dissent in Berkeley. Maybe people in the audience know more about it than I do, but I will still go on. And since I see my old friends from days of graduate school, I remember when I first proposed to teach a class on aesthetics and freedom, my former advisor, Barbara Johnson, told me, how can you teach such a class if neither of the two exist? So I think this, of course, was a challenging and provocative question. And of course, my work is perhaps a belated response to this question and an homage to Barbara Johnson, who actually understood paradoxes of aesthetics and freedom. So today my focus would be on the space of freedom at the intersection of aesthetics and politics. Specifically, I would focus on the practices of aesthetic estrangement as it links to what I call art of judging and practices of dissent. And I would propose, as Celeste already graciously did, an off-modern genealogy of the relationship between aesthetics and politics, and focus on my favorite characters, Shklovsky and Hannah Arendt, and also speak a little bit about East European dissidents. So I began my reflection on freedom with a sense of impasse, humility, and embarrassment. But I was inspired by the work of Hannah Arendt, that the errors would be following me. Look, there is already. Okay. I was inspired by the work of Hannah Arendt, who suggests that defining freedom is just as hopeless as squaring a circle. The experiment is forever asymptotic yet necessary. So she also suggests in her essay, What is Freedom?, a wonderful proposal of how to think about freedom. She says that the experience of freedom is something fundamentally strange, a new beginning, I'm summarizing many quotes, and a miracle of infinite improbability that occurs regularly in the public realm. Since freedom is one of the most used and abused words in present-day politics, it's almost challenging for me to explore it as something infinitely improbable and therefore nevertheless possible. So I would like to focus on some aspects of this definition. First of all, it's a miracle, but it's a human miracle. Freedom, as Aristotle said, is not doing what one wishes. Freedom is always defined with respect to the boundaries. And in the spirit of the new beginning, I want to brush history against the grain and imagine the what if, the potential relationship, potential possible relationships between art and politics. For Arendt, experience of freedom is our forgotten heritage, for which no particular discipline might be appropriate. I was very interested in the fact that she uses aesthetic metaphors. She speaks about experience of freedom as a kind of performance in the public realm. It's a performance with the rules, but not always by the rules. So it's a kind of a performance that leaves space for spontaneity and uncertainty. Arendt's essay was written after the Hungarian uprisal of 1956, so it's in a direct relationship to thinking about art of dissent. So I brought in this contemporary artwork, Not Mine, by Larry Kagan, which is for me kind of an artistic encryption of Arendtian freedom. This is not a special effect of Photoshop, but a carefully configured, discontinuous steel chains that under a certain oblique angle can produce this shadow play of freedom. So the space of freedom is this miracle of infinite improbability that is produced through multiple intertwined actions of many individuals. While improbable, it's not impossible. So I would just briefly speak about my project and perhaps offer like a broader map that's developed in my book. Sometimes I think my lecture is a little bit like this art image. I hope it will come together somehow at the end. So I would like to suggest kind of key concepts that I develop and then focus on one specific aspect. So I try, first of all, to say that I want to limit my scope of inquiry. My emphasis is not on the problem of free will or on psychological or inner freedom, but rather on space and experience of public freedom and its ground of possibility. So I propose my own vocabulary. First, I suggest that to think about freedom as a co-creation in the world. Experience of freedom involves human initiative and the architecture of public stage. What this means, and I develop it in the book, that I don't think of freedom as something sovereign or autonomous. I don't think of freedom as an effect of free market or of cunning reason or of history. Freedom really involves human agency and the element of the unpredictability. So secondly, and as I already said about architecture, it's always connected to the boundaries. It's not about boundlessness. It's about how we think boundaries, borders, membranes, connections. So my second important terms are what I call agnostic adventure. And here it's very important that freedom confronts uncertainty and incalculable risk. It's not about transgression or transcendence, but about expansion of potentialities. Freedom is not sublime, but liminal. Again, I'm very interested in the idea of freedom as a human miracle and experience of finitude. A lot has been done about the agonistic notion of freedom. So I am focusing not oppositionally, not so much on agonistic, but on the agnostic. How do we live with uncertainty? I wrote a book on nostalgia. How do we live beyond nostalgia? How do we confront change? So the other important issue is this experience of freedom at the intersection of aesthetics and politics, and the term I coined, estrangement for the world. This really would be the topic of my lecture today, so I'm just focusing on that. And finally, I begin by thinking about freedom from a cross-cultural point of view. The book is all shaped through dialogues and encounters, not through definitions or typologies. But I begin with this issue of cultural difference and end it with something else. Ultimately, what matters for me is not so much external pluralisms, but rather often pluralities within one culture and alternative solidarities beyond national borders. So plurality rather than pluralism. So I will tell you quickly how I got there. The book was conceived in turn of the century in reaction to the narratives of end of history, politics, and arts, triumphalist celebration of technology and free market. This is precisely when freedom was like extremely outmoded term. It was almost embarrassing to tell people that I'm working on freedom and dissent. Oh my God. So that seemed to be seemed to be necessary for me. And speaking of national borders, I look back at the time when I got my first insight into paradoxes of freedom. I owe them to an encounter with complete strangers in the Moscow restaurant Petrovich during the bygone summer of 1999, when nobody thought that Putin would actually come to power and when many historical potentialities seemed to be open. My neighbor at the restaurant happened to be a liberal financier by the name Gosha. This is a true story. I did not invent this name. So Gosha politely inquired, why would such a nice girl like you live in America? Why not, I asked Gosha. There is no freedom there. You see prohibitions everywhere. No trespassing, no smoking, no loitering. What if I want to smoke under the non-smoking sign? Or loiter? You can't do good business in such environment. It's just too boring. So my Russian acquaintance Gosha perceived contractual practices and public lawfulness as a form of hypocrisy and social conformity. He was not surprised by no smoking sign, but by the fact that nobody actually smoked next to it. What was boring for Gosha was not so much the existence of prohibitions, but their transparency and visibility. And let us not think that Gosha is here doing Schmittian or Agamben critique of the law. When I commented that in Moscow there are fences everywhere and doors without signs, he told me, well, you just have to know the right people to get in. So freedom was not merely a transgression of law, but a reliance on certain invisible set of cultural hierarchies. In Russian cultural mythologies, freedom in general is often not to be sought in the political or economic realm, but often in anti-politics, or at best in literature or an alternative spirituality. From Pushkin's Other Freedom to Dostoevsky's Freer Freedom, imagined in Penal Colony. So then I ask the question, is there really no trespassing of cultural differences? Or does the defense of cultural difference become an alibi to justify local forms of authoritarianism? and ways of eliminating internal dissent. Can one man's tyranny be another man's national community? Should we think of some kind of Russian freedom, American freedom, hyphenated freedom? Having lived half of my life in the westmost point of Russia and the other half on the eastern edge of the United States, I consider myself bi-coastal this way. I am forever haunted by the specter of two warring queens, the Mother Russia and the Statue of Liberty. This kind of personal and historical double exposure hopefully prompt me to recognize the fragile space of shared dreams and not only cultural differences. So through my research, I learned that the experience of freedom has never been valued equally throughout the history and across cultures. Even today, freedom is not synonymous with other highly desirable states of being, such as happiness, belonging, glory, intimacy, or even equality. While those states of equality suggest unity and fusion, freedom has an element of estrangement that by definition does not, however, exclude engagement with others in the public world. Sociologist Orlando Patterson, who wrote magisterial several volumes on the history of freedom in the Western world, observed that the positive conception of freedom, not merely as non-coercion, or in Greek adouleia, forgive my Greek, but a positive conception, eleuteria, emerges in Greek city-states, according to him, and I'm not a classicist, that it is connected to the fact that slaves were not executed, but slaves had the right to become citizens in the Athenian city-state. So the first moment when freedom is defined positively, it's not inner freedom, it's not the conception of personhood, it's a conception of rights in the public polis. And in fact, if we look at the language of even Stoics, people like Epictetus, they talk very often about acropolis of the soul, so in a polis. So in other words, they use public architecture to speak about interiority. So it seems that public conception of freedom is at the beginning. So, of course, so I also was very interested, and I worked a little bit on Greek tragedy, in the distinction between liberation and freedom. At the beginning, of course, you need a liberation. You need a sort of freedom from want and satisfaction of basic human needs. But then how do you move from liberation to freedom? Liberation often takes a lot of space and is quick in time. Freedom takes more time and reflection on space. So my hypothesis is that the space of freedom was colonized from the space of the sacred and centered on the redefinition of sacrifice, both in politics and the theater, and it's very much connected to the polis, agora, and Greek tragedy and the stage. So for me, the connection between art and politics, at least in this particular Western tradition, is kind of there at the beginning around the spectacle of freedom. Today, I will tell one particular story of interesting engagement of art and politics. I wanted to recover some unexpected connection in aesthetic and political theory, and offer this kind of eccentric genealogy of the relationship between aesthetics and politics. I was struck that in Viktor Shklovsky there are much more, for instance, political metaphors around conception of estrangement. I've written about it, so I will repeat some things and their new angle. And in Hannah Arendt, Reflection on Freedom, she very often uses aesthetic concepts, not only performance, but also deroutinization, very interested in concepts of imagination, or the ideas about banality that are not at all banal. So I wanted to bring the two together and see what happens. And of course, estrangement was one of the most malign theories of 20th century criticism, since I have here my friends from graduate school will remember how in our graduates pro-seminar in comparative literature, you start a course on literary theory with the essay on estrangement, and by the third week into the semester, you talk about overcoming estrangement already. So in my lecture today, I will not try to overcome estrangement, but rather come to terms with it by placing it in a different context. Here is Viktor Shklovsky yet again. So I'm very interested to develop the sort of Shklovskian idea of zigzag. As Celeste already said everything I was planning to say, or some things. I'm very interested in this whole idea of chess, of moves of the knight in the game of chess, and I'm trying to develop it quite broader than I can do today, because it's a way of kind of cheating on the straight narrative of progress. It's a way of exploring third routes, zigzags, spirals, diagonals, and potentialities. Roads not taken. This is my version, my collage dedicated to Shklovsky. Oops. So in a way, with my conception, and Shklovsky has also interestingly said that the road of zigzag is not a road of compromise, but in fact it's the road of the brave. And I would try to develop this point, also bringing in some politics of the Russian Revolution. So in my redefinition of the modern project, I wanted to get away from the endless ends of art, neo-avant trance, and charismatic post-criticism that tries to be desperately in. And I came up with this idea of off-modern that began as a joke almost in my art practice and then became uncannily serious. And I've checked the etymology of off with double F and discovered, interestingly, that it comes from of. So it begins with a belonging and then develops this distance with a second F. So when I think about off-modern, I think about also some unexplored potentialities of the modern project. And for me, it's very important in the relationship of the kind of peripheral geographies of modernity, kind of alternative solidarities that don't always work through the center. I'm also interested in recovering histories of what if. And the other aspects that interest me is the issue of technology and the ways of thinking about new media and the kind of alternative urbanism. Of course, luckily for you, I'm not going to develop all of that today. But it is kind of a very important and ongoing project. And in my view, since defining freedom is such a difficult enterprise, perhaps going in this off-modern way might allow us some new connections. So let me start straight on with something I've already also written about, but perhaps today will offer you a somewhat different take. This is from Viktor Shklovsky. I want to approach this issue of estrangement heads-on, not through Shklovsky's early essay, but through his analysis of urban monuments and urban architecture. Because in my view, this story gives us a very interesting kind of alternative way of thinking also about space of freedom and the whole genealogy of art and politics and Russian Revolution and Dissent. So Viktor Shklovsky describes in 1919, he's well known as a critic, of course, but also is a writer. So he describes in 1918 in Petrograd a monument to Alexander III, which is a Russian Tsar, which was covered by cardboard stall with all kinds of slogans celebrating liberty, art, and revolution. And this was called Monument to Liberty, which was one of those transient, non-objective monuments that exemplified early post-revolutionary visual propaganda. So I'm also very interested that in Russia there is very little iconography for the Statue of Liberty. So those kind of, during the avant-garde, we have a lot of non-representational monuments to liberty. And this is how Shklovsky describes it. There is a tombstone by the Nicolas station. A clay horse stands on its feet, planted apart, supporting the clay backside of a clay boss. They are covered by a wooden stole of the monuments to liberty, and so on. And then he focuses his attention strangely to those street kids. Street kids peddle cigarettes, and when militiamen with guns come to catch them, the boys shout, "Scram," whistle professionally, scatter and run towards the Monument to Liberty. There they take shelter and wait in the strange place in the emptiness beneath the boards between the Tsar and the Revolution. So what interests me here is a dual political symbol of monarchy and revolution turns into lively and ambivalent urban site inhabited by this unsubordinate Petrograd street kids. For me, it's interesting that the theorist sort of takes the point of view of the street kids who inhabit this third space between the Tsar and the revolution. It's simultaneously a ruin and a construction site, and there is this third space. For me, it's kind of like an occupy tactics, to use a contemporary term, occupy monumental propaganda. And Shklovsky performs kind of a double estrangement, defamiliarizing both. For me, this parable about transformation of the historical monument betrays the precariousness of writer's own political situation. It was very interesting for me, and in general I'm continuing with this project to look at actual politics of various avant-garde artists and theorists. Viktor Shklovsky was actually politically very active and was a socialist revolutionary. He joined Socialist Revolutionary Party and was actually a member of anti-Bolshevik underground together with Maxim Gorky. The difference with Bolsheviks was that they really believed in the need for the Constitutional Assembly. So after the October Revolution, of course, the Constitutional Assembly was disassembled, so to speak, or as a shut off by the Bolsheviks. And that's kind of very interesting and frequently forgotten page in the history of Russian Revolution. It's also very interesting because what it forgets is all the variety and plurality of possibilities that existed at that time. Whether they were realizable or not is another question. There were constitutional democrats, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting if we think about that when we look at how Shklovsky, for example, writes about Eisenstein early on. He's very critical of October, which creates kind of a mythological, mythical version of the October Revolution. There's virtually no visuals for the October Revolution, but it was restaged in a kind of Wagnerian total work in 1919, 1920. So Shklovsky is like very critical about the film October, but then he changes, he takes a zigzag. He says that, yes, Eisenstein makes a lot of errors, both in history and in his montage, but it's his errors that are more important than his total work, because through errors, Eisenstein manages to create an experimental visual language. So it's very interesting to see how Shklovsky works. He both disrupts that attempt to kind of create a total work of the revolution, but also always insists on the zigzag errand play and third possibility while it's still possible. Okay. So just to remind you again about estrangement, what's interesting for me today is not to think about estrangement as a device of literariness of literature, a device of autonomy, but think of estrangement as a practice that is also could be connected to public space. So Shklovsky famously said in his essay that habituation devours things, clothes, furniture, one's wife, and the fear of war. So artistic estrangement is what can make one's wife more lovable and the fear of war more real. So estrangement is what makes art artistic and by the same token makes life lively or worth living. However, estrangement, strictly speaking, is not a single technique or a set of stylistic techniques, but not that define a structure of an autonomous artistic corpus. Rather, as I would claim, it's a kind of practice. Estrangement lays bare boundaries between art and life, but never pretends to abolish or blur them. So estrangement is not merely a reverse mimesis, not merely a romantic gesture. It's an attempt to establish this third space. Estrangement does not allow for a seamless translation of life into art, nor for the wholesale aestheticization of politics. Art is only meaningful when it is not entirely in the service of real life or realpolitik. So Shklovsky's understanding of estrangement is different from both Hegelian and Marxist notion of alienation. Estrangement is not to be cured by incorporation, synthesis, or belonging, and in contrast to the Marxist notion of freedom that consists in overcoming alienation, Shklovskian estrangement is in itself a form of limited freedom that can be endangered by various kinds of modern teleologies and utopian visions of the future. So I was interested, this is my students after the class of estrangement. I saw the graffiti everywhere. So Shklovsky was very fond and gave a very interesting interpretation of Tatlin Tao. And again, I don't want to repeat myself. He is very interested in Tatlin Tao not as a failure of utopia. He actually believes that it's a success. He believes that it's a monument not to a technological function, but to a poetic function. And it's a monument that does not culminate with a synthesis. It's an open spiral, sort of like estrangement. It keeps the space of estrangement. And for Shklovsky, it is kind of ruin and construction site. He says that it has Martian and Ovidian quality. So it points with different vectors of time. And it's a playful monument, which also had a title, a monument to the liberation of humanity. So I skipped that part. Okay. So for me, Shklovsky's estrangement has been frequently perceived as estrangement from politics. Carlo Ginzburg suggests a connection to Stoic discourse on inner freedom, especially the work of Marcus Aurelius. I try to argue in a longer chapter that actually Shklovsky's estrangement, if we follow it through 1920s, through his literary text, in fact, it documents or tells a story of disappearance of this public sphere, possibility of the third space in the Soviet Russia. For instance, already in Sentimental Journey, Shklovsky talks a lot about cruelty and violence, and that's for me a very interesting project now, how to think about dehumanization of art and the question of estrangement, because I notice that what Shklovsky is doing is not estranging violence, he's estranging a revolutionary teleology that habituates violence. He says, citizens, pay attention, we are surrounded by corpses, and so on. So in a way, I notice how after the revolution, when Shklovsky claims life itself became very estranged, estrangement, in fact, starts to play a different role. If anything, it humanizes or draws attention to this sort of disappearing other space. So for me, that became very important. And then already in the third factory, estrangement, when Shklovsky talks about conscience and consciousness and the gap between the two, it becomes connected to the arts of doublespeak. And I try to claim that Shklovsky already in this text, which is of 1926, starts to point to this kind of political dimension of estrangement. And his contemporaries commented on that. Eichenbaum wrote that Shklovsky is like a Decembrist. He's unrecognized political writer. And Lydia Ginsburg also commented that the merry times of laying bare the device are over. So now we live in a different era. So contemporaries in the late 20s perceived Shklovsky in that way. So by 1930s, of course, formalism is forbidden. Shklovsky renounces formalism. I'm not going to go into that. But I believe that some practice, somehow this estrangement migrates into the other sphere and becomes a form of this doublespeak alternative practices. And I would show how during Sinyavsky trial and during the dissident, minor but still important dissident practices of 1960s, estrangement is revived and explicitly referred to all the time. So I want to begin to rethink the relationship between aesthetics and politics, away from lovely but misleading Benjaminian aphorism about aestheticizing politics versus politicizing arts, as if we have only two options. So you remember that in that famous essay, there are Bolsheviks and there are fascists, and there seems to be nobody in between. So I try to understand aesthetics. Oops, I always produce errors. Okay, I will speak in this microphone. So I try to understand aesthetics in the original sense of the word, neither as the analysis of autonomous works of art, nor as a connoisseurship of the beautiful, but a form of knowledge that proceeds through a peculiar interplay of sense, imagination, reason, and what Rancière called distribution of the sensible, although I don't fully buy his model. I don't like, oops, I stepped on something. Okay. I don't take the model of autonomy of aesthetics as a basis, but rather I'm interested in the idea of estrangement as connected to judging and radical perspectivism. So for me, there is a difference between aestheticizing politics as a way of making a total work and using aesthetic practice and experience as a practice of perspectivism and judging, which is never leading to total work, but in fact disrupting the total work. So I want to make this distinction of thinking of aestheticizing as making a total work and thinking of aesthetic practice via estrangement as a form of critical judgment. So had Hannah Arendt and Viktor Shklovsky crossed paths in Berlin and Marburg in 1920s, they might have discovered that in spite of differences in style, they share the art of estrangement. In fact, in her response to Gershom Scholem, Hannah Arendt said that she came to the political thinking through German philosophy, aesthetics, and romantic poetry, and also through Kant's philosophy. And I would be very short today on Arendt. What's original in Arendt's conception is her departure from the philosophical tradition in the very location of freedom. She actually says that philosopher cannot think the experience of freedom. She says that she became a political thinker in order to think freedom. Her location of freedom is not in the space of will, in the space of human psyche, but in public world. And as I already said, that for her, freedom is very much connected to performance arts and not to the art of poetry or to the art of making. And one could make many disagreements with Arendt. She loves to make distinctions, sometimes too firmly, but she insists on the performance because it also presumes a stage and certain kind of architecture. So freedom is not anti-architectural. It's all about partitions, but flexible partitions. And again, her concept of this performance is very much in opposition to total work or a Wagnerian idea of aestheticization of politics. So to sum up, it's possible for me, with Arendt in mind, to distinguish two kinds of estrangement. One I would call estrangement from the world, and the other estrangement for the world. Estrangement from the world has its origins in the Stoic conception of inner freedom, in Christian conception of freedom and salvation, and also in the Romantic subjectivity and introspection. Estrangement for the world is a kind of acknowledgement of human plurality, of a web of human interactions, and of a need for certain kind of co-creation with the others. So for me, estrangement for the world is rather fundamental for Arendtian thinking, and I kind of coined this term to bring Arendt and Shklovsky together. And Arendt makes a very interesting development. She moves from this thinking of the space of the political to think about the space of judging. And when she thinks about it, this begins, of course, with her work on Eichmann and the very conception of banality of evil. I spoke about it. Her conception of banality is actually very, very complex and has a lot to do with the work of Hermann Brock and others on the kind of dangers of kitsch, especially in the time of fashion. So I think her conception of banality has been trivialized. It's actually, if you know aesthetic theory, it's much more interesting. So Arendt begins by seeing freedom as a form of action in public space, but later she also thinks of practice of freedom as a form of judging and imagination, as long as imagination preserves what she calls care for the world. So when she writes about Eichmann, famously and provocatively, she speaks about, of course, disillusion of public sphere in totalitarianism, but also about, when she talks about Eichmann, it's his clicheistic consciousness and what she calls failure of imagination and colossal error of judgment that led to his behavior. So this kind of failure of imagination acquires, really, really important meaning for Arendt. She also very interestingly moves between thinking about political actors and thinking about writers. And again, I have to cut myself. I have a lot about that, but I have to cut it today. But in her analysis of Kafka, whom she makes into political players through the radical imagination that he offers us, that offers us alternative models of the universe that estrange, de-automatize our thinking. I just show this for you for one reason, that she uses zigzags a lot. That it also brings her together with Shklovsky. Political theorists are not very good in drawing imaginative diagrams, but I think it is interesting that she wants to emphasize that kind of in dialogue with Kafka, that the point of freedom and judgment is not about jumping and finding an Archimedean point from which to judge the world. It's about being engaged and being involved and following this kind of diagonal route of imagination. So for Arendt began to develop the theory of judgment. Unfortunately, she died of a heart attack, leaving only 2 epigraphs and the typewriter on her next project, which was supposed to be about judging. So we can only guess through different bits what her theory of judging would have been. But what's important, that judging for her is very much connected to this idea of this constant estrangement. Judging is not an applied art. It's a constant double movement and defamiliarizing experience defamiliarizing habits of thought in response to changing experience. The space of reflective judgment for Arendt is like a Mobius strip that moves seamlessly inside out, from known to the unknown, from familiar to the unpredictable, from reliable to improbable. It's through judging that we can build the serpentine line that can move from liberation to freedom. Arendt in her theories remains defiantly anti-Rousseauistic. She does not believe in building consensual community or volonté générale. She believes in constant, non-stop deliberation, dissent, alternative solidarities, conversation between friends. So for her, the space of judgment is never a space of complete transparency or complete darkness. It's always a shadow play, a chiaroscuro, a place of luminosity rather than enlightenment. She also uses many architectural metaphors. And one of architectural metaphors that is interesting for me, she talks about thinking without a banister, that we live in the world for which no former yardsticks work anymore. We live in the gap between the past and the future. We have to think without a banister. But it's interesting that it's thinking without a banister does not mean thinking without a staircase, if you wish, which is another spiral or diagonal. You always need partition architecture and some kind of foundation. So in a way, you can skip along a flight of stairs and a dancing gate, but you have to preserve our bearings to some extent on the diagonal or spiral staircase. Thinking without a banister is, in my view, akin to performing without the rules, but not with the rules, but not entirely by the rules, performing with the knowledge of history, but without historical determinism. Arendt is defiantly anti-Hegelian. She doesn't believe in what she calls divinity, we call history, yet she believes in kind of historical thought of another kind. Judgment and judgment and imagination, in her view, negotiate the space between and beyond. Judging with the care for the world keeps imagination in check. Imagination enlarges the possibilities of judging, and the process goes back and forth. Between is never completely bounded by familiar yardstick, but neither is beyond synonymous with boundlessness. To be less theoretical, here is a quote of contemporary South African artist William Kentridge that, in my view, uses a different language to say some of the same things. Kentridge says that I am interested in a political art, that is to say, in an art of ambiguity, contradiction, incomplete gestures, and uncertain endings, an art of politics in which optimism is kept in check and nihilism is kept at bay. So it's that kind of space that's important for us. So from here, I move to what I call arts of dissent. For me, very important that I use arts in plural. It's like techne, only it's not technologies, but techniques in the good formalist sense. So dissent etymologically means to sit apart, but how far apart? Being apart does not necessarily mean to be outside, on the margins, or in some kind of free autonomous zone. Quite on the contrary, it means also to be part of, to be a crucial participant. So for me, Dissent and Estrangement expose the limits of the permissible and uncover the boundaries of the public realm and of the deeply ingrained cultural mythologies. So I will again be very brief. I developed it in detail in my book. I'm just giving like a slightly different take on it. I wanted to give you just an example of Russian dissidents, specifically Andrei Sinyavsky and Alexander Yesenin-Volpin, and just look at how they use estrangement and how estrangement works in the public realm. So if my presentation were a film, there would be a fade out, and then 50 years later, it took 50 years for Viktor Shklovsky to re-enter the public sphere and sign a political proclamation in defense of two experimental writers, Sinyavsky and Daniel, who were put on trial in 1966. The same, or another protest letter was signed by Hannah Arendt and many other Western intellectuals. So, okay, here is Sinyavsky Terz. The trial of Andrei Sinyavsky, his pseudonym was Abram Terz, and Yuli Daniel, pseudonym Nikolai Arzhak, took place in February of 1966. They were accused, among other things, of anti-Soviet propaganda. That was the main charge, but also in anti-Semitism. The theory of estrangement was mobilized by the defense. So Andrei Sinyavsky was a well-known literary scholar. He was accused, there was a whole campaign in the newspapers against him that anticipated the trial, and I just wrote down the accusations. He was accused, as I already said, anti-Sovietism, anti-Semitism, Freudianism, depiction of explicit sexual acts, and the search for God. The lesser charges included plagiarism of Dostoevsky and Kafka, minus Kafka's social critique of conservative Philistines. He was also accused of the slander of the Russian people under the Jewish-sounding pseudonym that was somehow unsuited for a Russian writer. Andrei Sinyavsky is of Russian Orthodox faith in private. The campaign in the press that preceded the trial anticipated some of its outcome. Here is an example of a famous article. I'm translated it myself, so there are some strangeness in English, forgive me. It was called Turncoats, Перевертыши by Dmitry Iryomin. So I am interested here to just read it and look at quotation marks. In the bourgeois press and radio, information has appeared about the unsubstantiated arrest in Moscow of 2 writers who published their anti-Soviet slander abroad. Isn't this a perfect playground for the unclean consciousness and the equally unclean imagination of Western protagonists? And then from another, from Zoya Kedrina, Sinyavsky is trying to create an impression that in our country there is anti-Semitism, and the author called Abram Terz supposedly must look to publish abroad if he wishes to write sincerely. Oh, I'm sorry. Now I'm exposed with all my errors. Nothing is sacred for him in our country and its multinational culture. So it's very interesting how these articles develop their argument and why there are words in quotation marks. They don't come from any particular text and have no accompanying footnote. In fact, it's a familiar device from the Stalinist rhetoric to kind of give us not the information but the attitude, developing kind of a paranoid complicity with the readers. Curiously, the quoted words and passages present the most adequate description of the situation. So the facts are actually what's in quotation marks. There are 2 writers. They were arrested. So everything that's in quotation marks is actually documentary fact. So estrangement, the kind of state estrangement, or estrangement used in the campaign, is a way of kind of estrange common sense completely and create kind of this culture of paranoid insinuation. So Sinyavsky kind of played on this. And in his own speech, again, unlike the writers' trials during Stalinism, which were mostly show trials, when writers had to theatrically admit their guilt, often after torture, Sinyavsky does not admit guilt. He offers us kind of almost a literary account of his own trial, and again invokes this device of estrangement. A strange veil is created here during the trial, a special electrifying atmosphere. This is the atmosphere of the dark anti-Soviet underground, which is hidden behind the enlightened face of Sinyavsky, PhD in philology, and the poet and translator Daniel, who create plots, terrorist acts, pogroms, and murders. Here, truly, it's terrifying and surprising that the artistic device loses its literariness, and it's taken literally, so that the trial becomes a continuation of a text. So here, Sinyavsky returns estrangement, estranges the estrangement that his campaigners are presenting, and offers kind of a literary account that kind of lays bare the devices, if you wish. This didn't help him. He, of course, goes into imprisonment and exile. What Sinyavsky is working with is with this concept of free indirect discourse, obviously, and it's exactly the same defense that was mobilized during Flaubert's trial, and it's a story that continues and is more contemporary than we think. It's interesting that in this hostile Soviet court, semiotic theorist Vyacheslav Ivanov presented the formalist theory of Shklovsky's literary device without, of course, using the word formalism, but appealing to literary science. He was invited as a scientific expert And in the spirit of scholarly professionalism, which was gaining ground in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, he actually explains the theory of estrangement, the need to not literalize, to keep the difference between words and deeds, and most importantly, to distinguish between the writer and his characters. Again, this didn't help, but it was an interesting exercise in estrangement. But most important part of the trial is, however closed it was no longer the trial the way the trials were during the Stalin's period. It was recorded. It was an attempt to disrupt the kind of cultural mythologies and forms of behavior that existed. And of course, I'm trying to skip and move fast. Interestingly, that story by Ovsinyavsky did not stop there. First of all, it's interesting that he was asked why he chose the pseudonym Abram Terz, that to the judge sounded very Jewish, and it does sound like a name of Babel's gangster, the missing gangster. And Sinyavsky said that he just liked the name, and he didn't think of any national connotation, but later he also wrote that terz is like terza rima in Dante, so it also has another connotation, it's where Babel's gangster meets Dante, and the kind of artistic play and the third way of thinking. So Sinyavsky goes into exile. After 5 years, he lives in France. And then in the late 80s, he comes to visit his native country, and he finds himself in the center of another slanderous campaign around his work Strolls with Pushkin, which was written during his exile. This time he is accused in Russophobia and called Russian Salman Rushdie. So there was a group of nationalists guided by Shafarevich who wanted to apply fatwa to Sinyavsky. So Sinyavsky makes a very interesting statement in his text, which is called Dissent as a Personal Vacation, I think. Yes. He says, I quote, "If we are heretics, there should be many heresies. This is how I see the value of dissidents. Dissidents shouldn't become an embryo of a new church or new anti-Soviet state, but a pluralistic state, at least on paper." So I'm very interested in this kind of plurality, which for me is one of the interesting radical aspects of Sinyavsky's case, but also in that kind of not simply thinking of estrangement as a literary device, but something that can affect the public space. So seemingly opposite case is that of Alexander Yesenin-Volpin, who practiced what he called civil obedience, not civil disobedience, civil obedience, because he was a mathematician and a poet, a very eccentric character, and he believed that it's too early for the Soviet Union to have civil disobedience because the concept of civility and of social contract is in question. So he was his group advocated radical civil obedience, legality, and civility. So I have a slightly different take on Yesenin-Volpin than Ben Nathan's, who wrote a very important book about him. I believe that what Yesenin-Volpin does, on the surface, it seems to be complete opposite from Sinyavsky, who wanted to write plural, ambivalent literary texts that open up the sort of plurality in the public world. So he came with 50 people, Yesenin-Volpin, in December 5th, 1965, went to the Pushkin Monument. He stated the demonstration lasted only 20 minutes, 5 minutes more than 15 minutes of fame. After that, everybody was arrested. So during the interrogation, and Yesenin-Volpin also went through psychiatric hospitals, imprisonment. Now he lives actually in Boston. So here is just an example. He went with signs. There were two signs they were carrying. "We respect Soviet Constitution," and "Open trial for Andrei Sinyavsky." So here, this doesn't seem to be a huge crime. Come on the day of Soviet Constitution with a slogan, "We respect the Soviet Constitution." Here is a quote from the interrogation. Interrogator: "Alexander Sergeyevich, why did you come to the square?" Volpin: "In order to express what I was trying to express." But you were, interrogator, "But you were detained with a sign in your hands." Volpin: "I didn't detain myself. Why did others detain me?" Interrogator: "No, but still you were carrying a sign, 'Respect the Soviet Constitution,' correct?" Volpin: "Correct." Why did you make such a sign? Wolpin, so that people would respect the Soviet constitution. What do you think? Somebody doesn't respect it? Wolpin, that was not written on the sign. Interrogator, why did you choose this day? If I had come to the square on the 1st of May, I would have a sign, respect the 1st of May. So this is a very interesting text of interrogation. This is not the theater of absurd, but secret police interrogation. It's very interesting for me because here a transparent language that's actually stating what it means, literally, I came with a sign, is a kind viewed by interrogator as a provocation that implies subversive intent. So in a way, what, since I see Alexei Yurchak in the audience, what in my view Senin Volpin is doing is actually going deep at disrupting this kind of pretense recognitions, everyday mythologies and practices in the Soviet Union by appealing to the literal. So in my view, he is practicing public estrangement, although in this case it takes shape and form of being a literalist. He does not behave, because in the Soviet Union nobody behaves according to the written text, but to the unwritten practices. And that's what he's disrupting. So, what he's trying to disrupt is that kind of paranoid logic of insinuation, which I showed by using words in quotation marks, which are actually could be facts. So for me, it's a very interesting case that forces us to rethink the relationship between law and literature, and also an interesting cross-cultural case of this alternative solidarities and what I call pluralities within the culture that can connect with some elements in other cultures, producing interesting hybrids. So I believe that it's interesting for me. It's not by chance that I'm looking at 1960s, because 1960s will still live in the wake of 1960s and its unresolved failures in cross-cultural communication. You have lots of events in 1960s, obviously student revolts in Paris, student demonstrations in the United States, civil rights movements, as well as movements all over Latin America, Eastern Europe, from Zagreb to Buenos Aires. We also have Soviet tanks in Prague. This requires no comment. One is Jean-Luc Godard and the other is actual cultural revolution, that still don't always speak to one another. But I do believe that this trial of Sinyavsky is an interesting moment of cross-cultural solidarity. Those writers' trials draw international attention to the kind of forms of critique of the Soviet Union and inner critique of the left that was very, very useful and kind of opens up this plurality inside left, which can be very useful and important. So 20 years later, we still live with many interesting experience of dissent in Prague, Tirana, Mexico, Middle East, and now United States. Here is, of course, I'm referring to the Occupy movement. It's interesting that the word occupy has a double meaning, both occupy to grasp something mentally and to occupy the space. And there is constant play on two meanings of the word. Here you can't evict the idea. Also, the act of occupying space was initially conceived as an act of free speech. So it almost was formal. I had many discussions in New York. There was almost a formal aspect to the Occupy movement, that occupying space was enough, was an attempt to create alternative community. And now we have negotiations between autonomy and engagement with politics, building new consensus versus preserving minoritarian rights and of nonviolent dissent, occupying space as an Arendtian gesture of new beginning, and in logic, common territory of the political. So I think, these are some of my pictures. I also love the law tech of the Occupy movement. This is a wonderful thing. So I think looking at contemporary dissent, we have to be aware that they are not sole products of Facebook and Twitter, but a continuation of international practices in the public sphere. They are rooted in the local issues and inner pluralities, and often offer us a hybrid glocal histories. I think we need to develop a kind of modern history of international practices of dissent, which is not merely a history of defeat and co-option, but history of multiple agents and multiple possibilities for the future. History is not the enemy of the practices of dissent. The more we know history, the more interesting our future could be. So instead of seeing history as something inevitable and predetermined, Hannah Arendt suggested to project the idea of freedom into our own understanding of history and not to think of history as the divinity with capital D. So looking at the 20th century history, Arendt proposes to estrange the imminence of disaster. To do so, one has to look for the unforeseeable and unpredictable, for the more heavily the scales are weighted in favor of disaster, the more miraculous will the deed done in freedom appear. For it is disaster, not salvation, that always happens automatically, and therefore always must appear irresistible. So to end this part of my talk, Hannah Arendt distinguishes between what she calls professional thinking and non-professional or passionate thinking. Professional thinking is guided by concern with cognition and systematicity. Non-professional thinking, in her view, has origins in wonder and astonishment vis-à-vis cosmos and the world. And passion is not from passion as emotion, but passion as passivity and learning from experience. So the non-professional thinking is a kind of thinking through judging and imagination. And perhaps to think the heritage of freedom, one has to always engage in this experiment in passionate thinking. So as appropriate for off-modern reflection, I have a double epilogue. And I wanted to show you, expose myself. And show you my own project of historic phantasmagorias. Okay, this is what you've already seen, which was done for the 20th anniversary of the fall of Berlin Wall. So the idea that, for me, I was very interested in playing with these ghosts of history, using ghosts always in plural. Phantasmagoria literally means public gathering of ghosts, and theater of phantasmagorias began after the French Revolution, when people could visit in 1790s and kind of acquaint themselves with the ghosts of Marat, Danton, and Robespierre. It's a kind of hauntology of history. So in my project, Phantasmagorias of History, I actually record physical act of touching historical photograph, and I used very low-quality media. Just multiburst that's usually used for Pilates. So I wanted to find photographs of historical protests when history could have turned otherwise. This is Prague 68. And basically what I'm doing, I'm touching the picture, and the camera follows the glare and the cracks and opens up other potentialities. And some of the images, here is, I also call them turning the page of history, and I literalize the metaphor. So here I'm actually recording the act of touching and turning the page of history, and as it happens, Trotsky vanishes. So these images were projected on the wall. So they all record the invisible act of touching, looking back, and physical touch of historical photographs. And not Shklovsky that vanishes as well, but here Trotsky vanishes. And to conclude, I did the same thing of touching, same exercise of touching, of images of the actually here erased communists. This comes from David King's book, of which uses and shows doctored historical document. So for me, this is again turning the page of history, touching what looks like black square, but it's actually an erased face of the revolutionary who've fallen into disgrace. So for me, it also gives us an alternative twist of how to think about history of the avant-garde. So for me, those 16-second syncopated movements is an attempt to capture the butterfly effect in history, that mysterious shadow of wings that resist determinism. In the end, my phantasmagorias hopefully commemorate the deviant spirits of history and not one big brother Hegelian Geist. So, thank you very much.
Anyone who wants to ask questions, just please use the microphone so we can record you for posterity.
Yes, this one kept falling off. Yeah, maybe I turn it off and just respond. Okay. Hi.
I was really intrigued by what you said about Arendt and the Eichmann trial and how the banal can be read through, theories of aesthetics. And I was wondering about that also in relation to your other discussions of trials. In that, perspective, the state of Israel, according to Arendt's critique, can be read not only as bad readers, that misinterpreted that cultural object, but they essentially also those who produce that cultural artifact, namely persecuting Eichmann. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts also in regard to the other trials that you discussed about that double role of the state or of state authorities as both the viewers or the audience for that aesthetic artifact, but also those who participated in producing that artifact.
Mm-hmm. That's a very complicated question, and I was just rereading Arendt's Jewish writings, and she's very ambivalent in many of them, but I wouldn't go into this dangerous territory. There's been a book written about it, See No Evil, which uses Arendtian concept. Now the name escapes me. I was a former student at Harvard, Polish scholar. Okay. He coined the term authoritarian fiction, working with Arendt and trying to see, yes, that the state can also produce a certain kind of fiction. And in an interesting way in the discussion, but then it's not simply that she thinks that all aesthetic can do is produce a totalitarian fiction. She actually makes it, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, she has this interesting concept of inhumanity of imagination. It's very interesting, and I thought about it a lot because when she talks about totalitarianism as producing such degree of inhumanity that our common sense cannot embrace, that if we come up with psychological, sociological explanations, we might not be able to understand it. We have to estrange it and sort of understand it almost as fiction. So you need this kind of inhumanity of imagination to confront the inhumanity of the state fiction. So in that respect, so I'm thinking more of her part on the book on origins of totalitarianism, and she talks about ideology and how ideology is produced. And she's actually very good at analyzing that particular rhetoric, how that sometimes rhetoric of systematicity produces such a perfect logic that you almost cannot undo it except by estranging it, almost like this rational delusion of authoritarian fiction. So that's what I could think. About the Eichmann trial, I am not so fresh on that text right now to answer you exactly. About Israel, she has very many interesting and controversial statements. She also thought that it was state invented in freedom because it was improbable. And so it's very ambivalent. She says many interesting things. And, perhaps in her case, she didn't tie up all her loose ends. Because, as I said, she died leaving 2 epigraphs for the book on judging. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but she did have this. I think it is useful to think about state propaganda or, forms of nationalism or state creation as a form of fiction. It's just we shouldn't always use the word aesthetic as a negative term. We shouldn't always have this idea that aestheticizing politics, bad. There are other ways of using it as a form of perspectivism. So they're different fictions. Am I answering your question, or sort of?
Hi, thanks. I would just like to hear more explicitly how you conceive of the political and how you arrive at that conception. Because on the one hand, it seems that you understand, or sometimes you understand the political in terms of kind of public sphere, the polis where citizens debate their affairs, and yet your two examples have to do with a certain kind of policing of these investigations, etc. And then you have, at one point you point to the Occupy movement and an occupation of public space as a political act, which is problematic because on the one hand, at least in the United States, you have the public sphere seems to have vanished with the compartmentalization of media into the liberal media and the conservative media. No one watches the same TV, reads the same newspaper. It's a critique that's been made a lot these days. And then secondly, the critique of the Occupy movement. While the Occupy movement was good at changing the terms of political debate, the passage into politics would require electoral activism, not just occupying public space with your tent. So I would like to hear more about how you conceive of the political and how you arrive at that conception.
No, thank you very much. It's actually a really excellent question. And I'm thinking a lot about Occupy, and I'm in dialogue with them precisely around the issue of political. I'm not a political theorist, so I allow myself to use the word political differently. And I'm now aware, thanks to your question, that I use it maybe contradictory. Arendt was criticized often that her notion of the political is a little bit abstract and utopian. I rather like it at the beginning of my thinking of the political, not to think of the political in terms of policies, but first get back and to understand, and I've been reading for 5 years political theory, I don't come from that background, to just understand where things come from, where the ideas of contract and polis come from before turning to the present. Because I think if we open up history, we can see present in a less pessimistic way. So Arendtian concept of politics is rather abstract. It is connected to this idea of performance and where citizens do come together in public space. It also, in her later work, includes man-made culture. Right, so there is that kind of notion of the political that's not reducible to technocratic policies. However, even Arendt, first I start with her and then maybe get to me, she is not kind of anti-legalist, but she doesn't believe that public sphere should be reducible to legal or even discursive practices. So for me, it's interesting to at least keep on the back of my mind that somewhat utopian yet broad understanding of the political, and she's also critical of Marx and various other people, of conflating politics with economics, for example. So she's staying with Arendt, she's also been criticized, but it's very interesting. She presents a kind of critique of the social, right? So she believes that some revolutions were driven by the social and resulted in violence and terror, like French Revolution, and the others that were driven by the political, like American Revolution, had an interesting promise, which whether realized or not. So she, after her work on totalitarianism and after experiencing total collapse of the political, she wants to rehabilitate it. She doesn't take it for granted the way people who might have lived in America all their life can take for granted at least some space for it. So for me, it was initially very interesting as a non-political series to open it up and bring it all out. Now, yes, I do not agree that there's completely no public sphere. I think political is a contested concept. I agree with you about Occupy movement. There is a great tension, whether it's a social movement or political, whether sometimes, as I said, it's almost too formalist in a narrow sense. Like it's all about the form, it's all about occupying and performing the same plot of climbing the fence, of violating the border, of being arrested, and what next? How do you enlarge the larger understanding of the political? So this is a very important tension. So for me, in my own discourse, there might be a tension between political with small p, like political context, and political with big P, which is a Arendtian concept of the political. I use political intentionally because in a way, also coming from Russian and comparative literature, political is a very suspected term, and I feel that sometimes literary scholars do not engage with the political. We don't know how. So I think it's very important to not think that political is a bad word. I remember when I was working on the book, both Bush and Putin at that time, word political was a bad word. This is politics. Politicians usually say this is politics. So I want to keep multiple definitions at play. And I do not think that in America we should give up on that public space. It could always be reconquered. It has to be contested and reconquered. I don't think I am not a postmodernist. I don't believe we live in the culture of simulation. I think we live in the culture of disharmonious multiple modernities that are in conflict with one another. Maybe because I travel around the world and see it. Don't know. Olga. Hi.
I have a question about your use of the zigzag in the first part of the talk. The zigzag, as I understand it, is something uncontrolled. I mean, the movement of that gesture is sudden, it's unpredictable. And the example, the visual example you gave from Hannah Arendt, where you referenced the zigzag, was precisely the opposite, right? It was very controlled representation of her ideas. So I'm curious how you use zigzag, and for me the zigzag, and I'm wondering whether this makes any sense to you, has to do with moving towards something and recoiling, moving towards and away. It's very much the gesture of close-up and distancing. So,
Thank you very much. Yes, Arendt, I have the whole section on that. I think a diagram
the
doesn't...
example that you gave,
Yeah.
I'm specifically your example.
This is comes like there's a long discussion of Kafka that she offers, which is much more complex than what she draws. So my argument is that in writing, she gives much more interesting shape. Zigzags is an excellent question. And now I've done research on all these alternative geometries, on spirals, where they go back to William Hazlitt, the idea of serpentine line, to, I'm losing my English, Lawrence Stern, the squiggle. So there is a long tradition of thinking aesthetics through those serpentine lines. So I think Shklovsky uses the word zigzag. I use the word zigzag and the Knight's Move. So my reading of it, it really does refer to Stern's squiggle directly. Shklovsky is very interested in Stern, and there's a scholar who actually worked on that. Shklovsky is also very interested in Lobachevsky's alternative geometries. And for me, this is where it really, because she's very interested in parallelisms and the anecdote and parable. So I see zigzag not as recoiling and close up and distance, but it's kind of parallel, kind of, you know, this is why I use in my collage the anamorphose and alternative dimensions. So I think of it more as like different view of geometry itself, that you could have parallel lines that can somehow be connected, parallel lines that could be disconnected. So I see it as a more broadly quest in the like early 20th, early 20th century for this alternative ways of thinking fourth dimension, different spaces. Shklovsky himself uses contradictory metaphors. One is the knight's move that's to some extent controlled. It's a move in the game of chess. And then in the other place, zigzag. Could be uncontrolled.
You know who uses it a lot is Andrei Bely.
You know, everybody, I mean, Mandelstam.
For him, that is an important image.
Yeah, so that could be interesting. I cannot think. But Mandelstam also talks about the conversation about Dante, which was a surprise for me. He talks about honest zigzags. And there he talks about impulse formation and not making forms, but making impulses. And aesthetics should not be about formation, but impulse formation. So I see that zigzag is kind of has many potentialities. I'm now kind of exploring that. But it's also connected to this alternative idea of cultural evolution in Tynyanov, that you always go to everyday genres and rethink aesthetics, and it goes through the uncle. This is also my off-modern. You don't go through grandparents and Oedipal relationship, you also have lateral possibilities. So that is for me also very important. And I'm now looking in contemporary art, how contemporary artists use those forms of zigzags and spirals. So.
Svetlana, a question about the off-modern and its relationship to what you call the unrealized potential of the modern project. Let's take for granted your definition of historical modernity as a form of social progress and modernization. My question is, how off is your genealogy of the off-modern with respect to a very familiar story that we all know, which is the story of aesthetic and literary modernism as a whole? Mm-hmm. In other words, one could argue that the whole story of modernism is a kind of off-modern, and that the off-modern would be, in a sense, the standard gesture of modernism, whether it be a kind of relationship of, of the decadence, mm-hmm. a relationship of aristocratic disdain, or a much more active kind of critique of the teleological model that you propose of modernity. So what I'm trying to maybe encourage you to respond to is the question of how to make the off-modern any more off than the modernist tradition already is, and how your story is different mm-hmm. from the received history of modernism as we know it.
Mm-hmm. This is, of course, an excellent, huge question. I do distinguish between modernity and modernization. Right? Modernity, going back to Baudelaire, is a critical reflection on modernization. Right? So I do not think that off is completely off. As I said, double F is both distance and connection. So it's alternative plotting of history. And why is it alternative? I am not looking, for instance, in the relationship between decadence, avant-garde, socialist realism. I'm trying to say that there is plurality of things going on. Tatlin is making still lifes in the 30s. What are they? What history do they? So I'm very interested to look at the moments of transition and try to make alternative history where you don't have like the moment of kind of authenticity and death of the avant-garde and then socialist. You don't go through what formalists call dominantas. I'm not looking so much at dominantas. So I'm looking at kind of, for instance, when conceptual artists in the 50s, 60s, I interviewed Sokov and Komar Melamed and others, claim to have found the wings of Tatlin in the Moscow yard in 1950s. Right? So this belongs to no history. Tatlin was the sort of flying, supposed to be flying bicycle for the workers, flying vehicle that never flied. So supposedly it was just a failed project, and then it came to socialist realism. But this is one way, traditional way of constructing history, say Peter Berg at the end of the avant-garde, or the journal October, which is an alternative, or Boris Groys of socialism, of avant-garde into socialist realism. So I'm trying to propose that there is a different history. For instance, you could think of a kind of non-conformist practices of experimentation. So then from Tatlin to 50s conceptual art and underground culture, you can have a direct line. And if you look at that history, they persisted during the war, there were networks through which these things were transmitted. It's just history we don't know. It's precisely how modernism constructed its own history? I don't know, possibly. Or for instance, just to give you another example, Sinyavsky's father was a socialist revolutionary. Varlam Shalamov, the famous writer of Gulag, whom we think Gulag, he was a student of formalists. So in a way, you could see, it's true that, of course, modernism likes to have alternative histories. In a way, for me, the off-modern, it's often how artists make history. So it does not allow kind of distant reading. It's not a history from a bird's eye view when you see movements and dominantas and things leading this way. So it doesn't have a one plot, either Boris Groys or the journal October. That's like the struggle in art history, one camp or the other. I proposed at the other conference that there should be a journal February and March instead of just October. So there is like a plot which you see from this Archimedean view of a theorist who proposes a certain teleology of history. If you look at how artists think history, It's different. I think the off appeals a little more to the artists. It's perhaps foregrounding different branches, and I'm using these figures, spirals and zigzags and alternative geometries that come, of course, from modernity, but I'm not opposing that. So I think, to your question, it's the alternative plotting, alternative foregrounding, thinking of experimentalism, not merely avant-garde, not thinking isms, not thinking life and death of a movement, not having this plot of denouement, and ultimately not having the distanced reading of modernism, which I think what happened, and having more inside, using the meat, and then you see other connections. So it's a more literary or aesthetic model. I will think more about it, make it more of.
Actually, I have a question along those lines in terms of the off-modernism, but as well, one of the things that I'm not a Slavicist or Russianist, so, but I've always been, I found Shklovsky, forgive me, really very interesting because of the zigzag. But I was thinking in terms of, as you were talking about, you were trying to remove aesthetics as a bad word necessarily, but actually the historiographic elements of this, like the sort of formal historiographic. I mean, one of the things of history is not reflecting on itself in terms of the manner in which history is told. And when I found Shklovsky really interesting is, it's the 1920s, it's a, sort of interwar years, and there's a, there's a vast kind of undoing of historiographic writing, right? The sort of mechanistic, teleologies are all becoming undone. So I was just thinking if these alternative histories, what are sort of the, if you have any thoughts on sort of the formal aspects of the sort of the judgmental perspectival elements of the aesthetic in relation to history as the object, right, of telling history. What does that mean? And then also history in terms of the sort of temporal aspects of it, because one of the things that I loved about Shklovsky as well is there's the zigzag, but there's also that sense of an unfolding. There's also a sense of the openness of that temporality, of precisely not wanting to, teleologies fix things. There's a certain sense of, well, it's determinism, but there's also a sense of, sequential time there, right? And so, my question is, if you have thoughts on this, sort of the more, maybe the formal elements of the kind of potential historiography of this. This
is very interesting and huge question, of course. It's interesting. Formalists very early, I just give an example, wanted to do rhetorical analysis of Lenin's speeches, and in fact did some of it. This is extremely historical. In some ways, they wanted to write history of the present. Of course, that was not well regarded. And the second example, Shklovsky writes in the 20s how he's trying to protect documentary footage. He writes about Svershub. He says that there is almost no documentary footage from before the revolution. And Svershub, this documentarist, managed to preserve it. And he looks at this documentary footage. Oh my God, he noticed that people don't wear any shoes, whatever. But there's a moment when he cherishes the document. So in some ways, they had a great interest in the kind of history of the present, where I see Shklovsky, for instance, doing sometimes something similar to Walter Benjamin, if I think of Benjamin's essay Moscow, that they wanted to capture the materiality of the present that becomes almost impossible enterprise by the end of 1920s. So in some ways, this is one part of the question. They were very attuned to that material history of the present. You can talk about materiality of language as well, which was becoming more and more suspect through the kind of stage and official version of history. So in a way, they were kind of pushing through their practice of kind of third space to continue with a material depiction of what was going on, like through these monuments and ruins in Shklovsky's essays, The Night's Move, for example, which is similar to what Benjamin was doing in Essay Moscow, describing parts of Moscow that would soon disappear. So it's interesting that some of these theorists who often supposedly made historical mistakes or didn't talk about history are in fact engaged in the history of the present. This is one topic. I think there are many ideas, first of all, in the way history of formalism was written. This is something I'm contesting also with my off-modern, and many people in the Slavic field do it as well. I'm not alone by any means. But it was written through kind of narrative of like Roman Jakobson leading to French structures. And things always have to lead somewhere. And Shklovsky doesn't lead anywhere. It's parables, anecdotes, ambiguities, zigzags. Where is it going? So the history was written through other parts of formalism. So I really want to think about also history of formalism that was not at all as formal. It's not new criticism. It's something actually political. I'm talking about Shklovsky, who was politically engaged. So this is part of it, is to think history of formalism. To think about how formalists thought history, one thing is about the present, the other thing, they had very interesting ideas about evolution, which were not quite Darwinian. Also, Mandelstam writes about it a lot, trying to think about different models for cultural evolution. Thinking with Darwin, but also with Einstein, using kind of modernist science to think about evolution. And probably one could think history with those ideas. And also somebody like Bergson was very important for them, with long durations of time. So also alternative conception of time would be important. So I think this would be... But for me, for the off-modern, again, working with contemporary artists, there is like, I'll give one example, filmmaker Forgách, Peter Forgách, Hungarian filmmaker, I don't know if anybody knows him. He does films which are kind of like off history. Like he has a film about Spanish Civil War based completely on letters and documents of like supposed Franquista and supposed Republican. And if those two people were the main players, the war would not have happened. So in a way, through documents, he shows us how history could have turned otherwise. So for me, this would be a perfect off-modern example that there were possibilities, at least to open that up. And, you know, so this is how my thinking goes, but it's a big question. These are really big, serious, important questions. No, yeah, I'm happy to.